dismantled in the art of the Center of Technical Creativity. I'm wondering, does the Kiev regime not think he's the first cosmonaut? What happened to him? Is he not himself anymore? For so many years this memorial has been there, so what changed? And what's absurd is that Soviet scientists who were born on the territory of modern Ukraine, no matter who they claim themselves to be, how they were recorded in their documents, how they defined themselves according to culture, they also claimed that they are Ukrainians. But as far as I remember, and no one has debunked it yet, that there is some information that even Korolev, the inventor, the famous inventor, is apparently Ukrainian. So I have a following question. If Korolev is Ukrainian, then why his artworks, or why Gagarin and his memorial has been destroyed? It is simply absurd. We need to follow some kind of logic, but there is no logic. Because as I've already mentioned, when a person or a society is stricken by neo-Nazism, there are no laws of physics, laws of logic, or no morality. They disappear first. And on June 17th, the same fate befell the buste of the Soviet educator and writer Alexander Makarenko in Vinogradov, Transcarpathian region. And they didn't even pay attention that this is actually a Ukrainian last name. There is no logic, as I've already mentioned. It's a very strict, in its terminal stage illness called neo-Nazism. The Zelensky regime demolished almost all monuments dedicated to the Great Patriotic War, to prominent figures in Russian culture and history. Speaking of Great Patriotic War, what happened there? Were there no Ukrainians there? If we look at the last names, a lot of them have been recorded as Ukrainians, great heads of armies who belonged to the Red Army. Were they not Ukrainians? What happened to that? Unfortunately, there is no answer to that question. There is the only answer. This is an illness. Neo-Nazism and fascism, in all its forms of racial discrimination, racism, xenophobia, is an illness, and unfortunately it cannot be cured. It seems as though everything has already been demolished, destroyed, but I fear that the need to constantly break remains. On June 15, another meeting was held on defense assistance to Ukraine in the Ramstein format. It was announced that its support would continue, and despite the acknowledgement of the virtual failure of the so-called AFU counteroffensive, which of course has been prepared by the NATO forces, the NATO forces continue to stubbornly push Kiev into suicidal military action, promising to pump the country with weapons for as long as it takes. One can only wonder how many people have to die for Ukraine to stop and come to its senses. Just ask a simple question. Perhaps they're being used. Perhaps they're simply being destroyed, and not by those who they claim to be the enemies, but by those who are supplying them with weapons. It's a cynical game conducted by the West from people who put their trust in them. In addition, every such Ramstein means an increased burden for the American and European taxpayers. But who takes them into account? This is also a map that is only presented to the elections. And huge amounts of money are not being spent on the social needs of the EU and US population, not on improving healthcare, education, or economic development, but are drowning in the bloody maelstrom of Ukraine. It has become known that the lion's share of humanitarian aid from Europeans and Americans to the Ukrainian population is easy prey for the corrupt functionaries of the Kiev regime. There are constantly new facts of the organization of grey schemes for the development of such assistance, and in fact, the banal squandering and theft of humanitarian goods, their sale in various retail outlets throughout the country. Up to a third of such shipments are lost somewhere on the way to their addresses, and this information fully corresponds to the popular idea of the current authorities in Ukraine, who long forgotten about the welfare of their fellow citizens and think only about personal enrichment. And we bring up the subject of opportunities or perspectives, the so-called European perspectives of Ukraine of entering the European Union, or at least reaching that far dream of theirs. Political specialists in Brussels mention the same thing, that with such level of corruption that is seen in Ukraine, European Union is simply out of question. And the question is not about if you can dream about it or not, it's just the corruption on the Ukrainian territory. It has surpassed any previous figures, right at the point where the European Union, Washington and London have started try to release the protectorate over the Ukrainian territory, where American ministers appeared there, where American counselors started working there, where the Ukrainian government talks are conducted not by the head of the Ukrainian government, not the Ukrainian president, but Vice President of the United States of America, back then Joe Biden. Even the acting president, Mr. Poroshenko, was set there among his ministers and had to listen to that lesson as a schoolboy. And we're seeing for ourselves what is happening with the Biden family, but their own personal experience was used over the entire territory of Ukraine. This is the legacy that they left behind and interpolated there. Not a single week passes without a Ukrainian neo-Nazi making yet another Goebbels-style statement about his plans to exterminate Russians. And this time again, Mr. Podolak, advisor to the head of Zelensky's office, by talking about the coveted counterattack by the AFU, he said the following, a direct quote: "There's one plan, maximum hard advance with maximum killing of Russians on this route." End of quote. Senator Graham and the advice from Mr. Bush Jr. that was professed not long ago, what they expect from Ukraine, what is the Ukraine's mission, why they continue to invest in the Kiev regime to kill as many Russians as possible. It's a futile effort. Russia will not leave. As we've mentioned many, many times, even at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum by our President, Mr. Putin, such plans and appeals unpunished, and all Nazi criminals will receive the punishment they deserve and will answer for their crimes. And the tasks of the denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine will certainly be fulfilled.
On the 19th of June, a conference was held in Donetsk on the crimes of the Ukrainian armed forces in Artomovsk. Among the abundant evidence is the testimony on the atrocities against local residents. They killed local residents during their retreat, blew up houses in which there were civilians. The evidence of the Ukrainian army crimes in Artomovsk will be passed to the UN and other international organizations, and they will become a basis for a series of criminal cases. As Daria Morozova, ombudsman of the Donetsk People Republic, confirmed, the criminal actions of the Ukrainian fighters must be assessed not only at the level of Russia's national legislation. The Kiev regime is flagrantly violating international humanitarian law, and all of them will face the global tribunal. Tomorrow, on the 22nd of June, it will be the day of remembrance and mourning in our country. 82 years ago, our ancestors defeated Nazism, and they rid the Europe of the horror of the Brown Plague. Now the task before Russia is similar, to eradicate Nazism that is rearing its head, and we have no other way but to fulfill it with honor to the victorious end. We will go back to that date, the 22nd of June, and I would like to mention that in the airspace of Germany, the exercise Air Defenders 23 is underway now. It's the largest exercise from the creation of NATO. Around 250 aircraft take part, including 100 American aircraft. It demonstrates that Washington and its allies are developing operational plans for warfare with a comparable enemy. It is clear who is meant by this. During the last decades, Russia has always been mentioned. Baltops 23 also fits this logic. It took place from 4th to 16th of June. The Kaliningrad region of Russia and the maritime areas adjacent to it. Such that the military machine of NATO has nothing to do with defense. Its efforts are exclusively aimed at all-round deterrence of our country and practicing attack options against Russia. And any attempts to threaten the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the Russian Federation will not remain without consequences for its initiators. Now let us have a look at what is happening in Kosovo. The situation in the Serbian province of Kosovo and Metohija is steadily worsening. The so-called self-proclaimed Prime Minister Albin Kurti is leading the situation into a military confrontation. The provocations are becoming even more sophisticated. Illegal detentions of citizens and blocking of the entry on Serbian transport, Serbian tracts continues. Again, Serbian children became victims of Pristina's punishes. The so-called Albanian Kosovo police beat up minor brother and sister Christian and Dara Radoslajevic. The Kosovo militants made them kneel down, uttering monstrous threats. Only the arrival at the scene of the mother of the children saved the victims. Crimes against civilians, children and women are typical of Kosovo Albanian militants. So what does the West, who is patronizing the situation in the region, I would remind, and speaks about its mediator activities and peacemaking activities for many years, the US and the EU continue to turn a blind eye to Kurti's subversive actions, deliberately bringing the settlement to a standstill in order to force the Serbs to give up their vital interests. The habit of Washington, London and Brussels to please those they are associating Kosovo with the Albanians, it is ineradicable. You know that very well from the recent history. Starting from April 2013, Pristina continues to sabotage the commitment to the creation of the community of sub-municipalities in Kosovo. But instead of pressuring the Kosovars, the US mediators are preparing the ground for a radical curtailment of the community's powers and replace it with a so-called mechanism to protect linguistic rights, and support Kurti's thesis that this structure is allegedly non-territorial. That would lead the region to a new catastrophe, another one. And the stable basis for regulation for the settlement exists. It is the UN Security Council Resolution 1244. And it is the basis for negotiations between Belgrade and Pristina. And how the situation used to develop in the Balkans when the Western curators approached it with their recipes. Between June 13th and July 13th, 1878, a diplomatic congress took place in Berlin. The formal purpose of that was to sum up the results of the victorious Russian-Turkish war, victorious for Russia. And the representatives, the elite of the European diplomacy of that time took part in those negotiations. And the aim was to stop, to prevent the movement of Russia in the Balkans. They tried to reconsider the conditions of the preliminary peace of St. Stefana between Russia and Turkey, which was concluded in 1878. And the greatest anti-Russian zeal during the diplomatic battles was demonstrated by London. They offered to place borders in the Balkans not on political and or economic ground, but in accordance with their own interests. And our country had to protect the outcome of that war on the diplomatic front, not for its own sake, but for the sake of justice, for the sake of legality. In order for the centuries-old struggle of the Balkan peoples for state independence, for true sovereignty, that was back then massively supported by the entire Russian society, all that happened back then. Although the Congress changed the terms of St. Stefana to the detriment of Russia, and the Russian delegation, headed by the Chancellor of the Russian Empire, His Serene Highness Prince Alexander Gorchakov, achieved the recognition of Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania. The way was open for Bulgaria to gain independence, and the problems of Albanian and Macedonian statehood were outlined. And our representatives tried just to protect their position. And the best parts of Turkey were taken by the countries that did not participate in the war, but that positioned themselves as peacemakers. Those were Austria, Hungary, and England. The results of the Congress became known later, during the Balkan Wars of 1912, 1913, and the First World War that followed. The aim was to limit Russia's influence in the Balkans. A hotbed of tension was deliberately created in the Balkans, and it was a basis to create the conditions for new and violent conflicts. We honor the memory of 200,000 Russian soldiers who fell during the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-1878 for the independence of the Balkan peoples, and we value the attitude of the citizens of Serbia, Montenegro, and other countries who know that history. And the policy that is conducted in those countries by the West, trying to reconsider the history of connections with Russia. They continue to cherish the memory of Russia's decisive contribution to the attainment of their independence. Some words with regard to the situation in Syria. It is a return to their permanent residence of millions of refugees. Without that, the final normalization in the Syrian Arab Republic cannot be ensured. And the tension that is caused by those people in neighboring countries, in Jordan, Turkey, and the efforts conducted in the Astana Forum format. And in Syria, the major threat that forced the Syrians to leave their homeland, that major threat has been eliminated, but there is a problem. We would formulate the question, who is creating obstacles for such return? The answer is obvious. The US and the Western countries continue anti-Syria policy with determination, and they put obstacles to settlement also of the mentioned problem. It has been serious blockade, not lifted even during the process of the pandemics. And sophisticated political means influencing the specialized agencies of the United Nations, the UN Commissioner for Refugees in particular. A large share of multi-billion contributions that the countries give during their conferences are sent not to the territories controlled by the government of Syria that who are ready to receive the returning people, but to the countries where the refugees are currently residing. So when they take a decision to return to their homeland, they are deprived of the UN aid and are just left by themselves. And just the life forces them to make such decisions. And it is a challenge for such states as Lebanon, Jordan, and another means of influence is the alleged atrocities promoted by the Western countries of those who returned to their homeland. So they are just intimidating picture. The displaced people. There is also work conducted through special activists and even UN employees. Provocative questionnaires in order to convince the refugees that they should not come back to their homeland in the near time. So these are the games that have become part of the Western logic. Desire to harm Damascus, to use this tragic situation with the refugees for their political purposes. It risks destabilizing consequences for a whole range of states in the region. We hope that the return of the Syrian Arab Republic to the Arab family and the restoration of the relations of Damascus with its regional neighbors will contribute to the return of the Syrian refugees to their homeland, to the places of their permanent residence. We will continue to facilitate that together with the Syrian government. I would also like to mention the projects in Africa on connected with UNESCO. Last week, the program on communications development of UNESCO finished in Paris, and it is support for the media outlets in developing countries, and our country declared a voluntary contribution of $250,000 for humanitarian projects in African countries. And those initiatives were proposed by the Africans themselves, and they reflect the true, not imposed from the outside, needs for the journalists in Africa. The Russian Federation fully supports the development of the media in Africa, and is included into the group of friends in order to increase the African profile in the activities of this organization. Our support will continue also in other areas of the work of UNESCO. And one more important cultural event on the 16th of June, following the termination of the end of the 16th meeting of Russian compatriots, there was a trip of the participants in the event to the Patriot Park. The compatriots laid flowers to the monument to the martyrs of victors, visited the main cathedral of the armed forces, and examined the museum complex, the Road of Memory, and other sites. They also laid a memorial stone in the alley of compatriots in the park. We hope that this tradition to visit the park and plant trees will continue. And now in Addis Ababa, from the 27th to the 30th of June, there will be Days of Spiritual Culture of Russia in Ethiopia. They are held jointly with the Ministry of Culture of the Russian Federation and the Moscow Patriarchate. There will be an event with the participation of the Kizhi State Historical Architectural Museum. It is included in the UNESCO World Heritage List, and it is a basis. There will be a round table on the proximity of cultural and spiritual heritage. And the participants will include the Russian Orthodox Church, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and the leading institutions in culture and art. And I would also like to dwell in details on the date that will be tomorrow. I have already said that tomorrow it will be 82 years from the beginning of the Great Patriotic War. This date has been called the Day of Remembrance and Mourning officially. It is still pain, mourning for the crippled fate of millions of people, and now for their memory. For some reasons, from the point of view of someone in the West, should be forgotten, but we will not allow that. Fate of millions of people, and now for their memory. For some reasons, from the point of view of someone in the West, should be forgotten, but we will not allow that. From the point of view of someone in the West, should be forgotten, but we will not allow that. Totally destroyed on the territory of the Western Europe, and not condemned by the Nuremberg Tribunal to the full extent, because many avoided punishment back then. More than 1,500,000 cities and towns were destroyed. And if we speak about settlements and villages, it is more than 70,000 villages in our country. The Soviet Union bore the major weight of the Second World War on its shoulders. Its cumulative losses were 40%, almost 27 million people, and it showed, unfortunately, the vitality of Nazi ideology. And as we have already mentioned today, and we often mentioned, Nazism was recreated, and its bases were the hotbeds of collaborators, Nazi remnants in the West. They were not just pardoned by the Western political elites for their own selfish interests, but they were preserved for the future. They were just justified, but that cannot be justified.
We have to admit, frankly, not even 80 years later, the Anglo-Saxons tried to use Nazism as a battering ram to crush Russia, but only now they decided to assign the role of the fascist Germany in the 30s of the 20th century to Ukraine and the Kiev regime, which is, of course, beyond any measure of good or bad, because Ukraine itself experienced all the hardship and atrocities of the Nazi occupation during the war. If you read the materials, if you look at the footage of the chronicles, or if you just take a look at the documents, at the facts of the Nuremberg plan, you will see how smartly the West can carry out such business. And now we understand that all these scenarios, all these plans have never been abandoned by the West. even despite the criticism of what they had created on the German territory using fascists. This work has been carried out systematically over the past decades. This work of breeding and feeding people who were close to Nazism and fascism. I would like to recall back in 2008 at the 20th NATO summit in Bucharest, Ukraine was lured by potential membership in NATO, and then, realizing that they are under the geopolitical patronage of the West, the Ukrainian neo-nationalists, with tacit approval of the US and its allies, began to actively strengthen their position, including in the power structures of Ukraine. And the voting on the Russian resolution on counteraction to glorification of Nazism, neo-Nazism, and related practices, as was constantly voted against by the USA and Ukraine until 2022, and now by the whole West, including the Axis countries, Germany, Italy, and Japan, is a telling fact, clearly demonstrating the involvement of Anglo-Saxons in formation of Nazi ideology of the current Kiev regime. And later, Washington and its allies turned a blind eye to all the atrocities and lawlessness happening in Ukraine. First, the legislative reforms, the so-called decommunization, and of course it's not a decommunization at all. If they did want to carry out a decommunization, they probably would have paid attention to something else and not try to carry out totalitarian practices. So everything that has been carried out under the decommunization pretext was actually aimed against Russia. And of course the glorification of Ukrainian accomplices of the German Nazis from the ranks of the OUN-UPA. And what took place after that is hard to explain. There were persecution of veterans of the Great Patriotic War in Ukraine, and then in practice, the horrific scenes of Nazi Germany in the 1930s were revived. The Russian-speaking population of the country was harassed, and sometimes even medieval mockery. Remember the mass burning of the trade union house in Odessa in May 2014. Dissenters and political opponents were summarily murdered, and the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church were persecuted. Residents of Donbass were blatantly exterminated by ideological followers of Bandera and his associates. And of course, right now, at the Ukrainian territory, they're very close to the canonization of Banderas. They already have a baptized icon with their image. Not by Raskolnikov, but by people who detached already baptized icons. It's clear that we're not far from their faces being demonstrated. Ukrainian neo-Nazism has been nurtured for years from the outside. And armed by the collective West, which is now a de facto proxy party to the conflict in Ukraine, has been aiming at it for years. However, we, the heirs of the great victory generation, we have no moral right to allow the Nazi ideology to take revenge. We remember what horrors Nazism led to, what forces the entire world had to use to defeat it. And we see these atrocities today. We see that the work that hasn't been finished yet is unfortunately giving consequences today. We bow to the memory of our fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers who fell during the Great Patriotic War. As part of the special military operation in Ukraine, our servicemen today continue their righteous. As a tribute to the victims of the Great Patriotic War, state flags will be lowered throughout the country on the 22nd of June. A minute of silence will be observed because we remember. We will not forbid this memory, and we will get the justice, because this justice is backed up by the history of peoples who not only fell victims to that regime, but also found enough strength to voluntarily sacrifice their lives for the lives of their relatives, unknown people, and even for future generations. And I'm ready to answer your questions. Is the internet